Greetings. My name is Serge Dukhanov, and today it is my honor and pleasure to greet Mr. Paul Craig Roberts, Chairman of the Institute for Political Economy. In the Reagan Administration, Mr. Roberts served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy. Dr. Roberts is one of the most respected columnists in the alternative media. His syndicated articles can be read on many leading alternative news websites, including Lou Rockwell, InfoWars, Counterpunch, Information Clearinghouse, and many others. Good day and welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Roberts, the meeting of the presidents of our two respective countries is over. They seem to have agreed on something. Still, what do you think was the reason that Mr. Biden, on whose initiative the meeting took place, needed it so much? Did the new Russian weapon systems play a role? Was it China? And did he get what he wanted? He had wanted.
Well, it's not clear what was wanted, and the whole question of why the summit is not clear either. Possibly, Washington wanted to move the Russian issue off of the front burner to the back of the stove because of the concern with China. China is making a tremendous amount of progress in Asia in replacing the United States as the country looked to for leadership. And its economic dealings and the success of its own internal economy. So Washington has noted that when it makes provocative actions against China and provocative statements, the Chinese very aggressively stand up against these accusations. And so China is showing a great deal of confidence, and the rest of Asia notices how confidently the Chinese stand up to American accusations and American confrontations. The Chinese show increasingly contempt for the way Washington tries to treat them. You may remember the meetings in Alaska where the Chinese gave what is called a dressing down to the American Secretary of State. So when Asia sees such confidence on the part of the Chinese, that further weakens American influence. So I think this is a big concern to Washington, and maybe they just don't feel they have the ability to confront two major powers simultaneously. And so let's have a meeting with Putin and say some nice words, and then we can move that out of the news and we can focus on the Chinese, because they are now a bigger threat to us than the Russians, because they're actually taking over our leadership in Asia. That may be the reason. Otherwise, it's hard to explain, because you have to remember Biden is a product of the Democrats. The Democrats were totally opposed to Trump meeting with Putin. So why would they want Biden to meet with Putin? So it has to be some reason of convenience. And maybe I described it.
Could they have hoped to, say, eliminate the new Russian weapon system?
Oh, no.
No?
No. No, I think the Russian weapon systems, their superiority, that substitutes for the tremendous amount of money the Americans spend. The Russians don't have to. It'll be 10 years before the Americans have those kinds of weapon systems. So it gives Russia a decade to develop internally, to make friends externally, and hopefully influence the Americans to come to some reasonable accommodation, the way Reagan and Gorbachev did.
Mm-hmm. You once said that if Washington had such kind of weapon systems, it could attack Russia.
Yes, because there are people in Washington who are so determined to have American unilateralism that they want to get rid of Russia. And I think if those people had the kinds of hypersonic weapons the Russians have, Russia would be in danger of attack. Others may block the influence of these people, but they may not. You can always create false flag events, and they're notorious in American experience.
But then, sorry.
So yes, I'm glad we've got 10 years for hope that Washington will give up its hegemonic aspirations and accept other countries and try to pull in its horns so that everybody can somehow meet their objectives without doing damage to the other.
That was just the remark I wanted to make, that at least if we take into consideration the 10 years that Russia is ahead of the United States, it means that the world peace at least has the hope for 10 relatively peaceful years.
Yes, it does, except, as I have stressed before, the high level of tensions that have been created since the Soviet collapse. These are dangerous because of the unreliability of warning systems. The early warning systems often give false information of incoming missiles. And apparently this happened many times during the original Cold War. But they weren't believed because the two countries were trying to work together to reduce tensions. But the tensions have been built so high now, the danger is a false alarm would be believed. And this is the real danger of the tensions. And it's why, in my view, it's urgent that Washington give up this Russia-phobic, anti-Russia attitude, because it's spread among the people. The American people think Russia's an enemy. And that's always dangerous.
Yes.
So, the neoconservatives, in my view, are blamed for this because of this Wolfowitz doctrine of American hegemony, and that the main goal of American foreign policy is to prevent the rise of any power that could constrain American unilateralism. Now, that is a war doctrine. It means everyone else has to agree to be a puppet, or there's going to be a war. And that attitude is the dangerous attitude. And that's the attitude, the insistence that Russia is an enemy. That's why it's so hard to have better relations. It's not the Russians' fault. It's the fault of this doctrine.
Also, before the summit, you spoke about the, so to speak, the danger of a propaganda trap prepared for Putin. Do you think that your forecast has come true?
Yes, I do. I think that when Biden said that it would be very, very bad for Russia if Navalny were to die in prison, this was an insinuation that the Russians would maybe kill Navalny in the prison. And of course, in the West, Navalny is presented as a great popular opposition leader, the real Democrat, as opposed to a Putin who's presented as a dictator and corrupt. And of course, Navalny has not got much support in Russia, but he has tremendous support in the American press. And so the Americans think that he's like a main leader. He's just being oppressed. So I think when Biden said that, he set up Putin for the press conference, because Putin held an open press conference. And so the American reporters seized on Biden's statement and questioned Putin on why was he so scared that he had to poison and imprison his political opponents. Well, in other words, here you had the accusation coming from the media in the press conference. Well, the people in the world did not see the meeting between Putin and Biden. They don't know what happened in the meeting. They only see the press conference. And so what do they get from the press conference? Oh, Putin, he poisons and imprisons his political opponents. So the propaganda trap worked. And it had the help of Putin's openness. Now, you can see why Putin would say, I'm going to be open to show we've nothing to fear. We don't. But if you're being set up, you're not being dealt with fairly, it's a mistake. And so I think that the propaganda succeeded for Biden. It reaffirmed that all is not right in Russia. The political opponents are poisoned and imprisoned. And so this then confirms the view of Russia as a bad place and an enemy and so
on. Sir, before the summit, the Russian expert community entertained the idea that the main goal of the summit would be to develop the commonly acceptable rules of confrontation. What's your take on this idea?
Well, I think it's nonsensical, because you don't want confrontation. The summit should be about dismantling confrontation, not building rules to enable it. It's kind of like Reagan wanted to end the Cold War, so he wanted to speak with Gorbachev. He wanted to end the Cold War, to avoid confrontation, because confrontation is dangerous between nuclear powers. So that kind of statement, it sounds like an excuse to keep bad relations going, but we're just going to govern them a little bit more closely so they don't break loose and get out of control. But you can't do that. You can't tell what's going to cause a fatal misunderstanding. Misunderstandings are endemic in life and between people, between parents and children, between husbands and wives, between people who know each other very well, they have misunderstandings. And so certainly two superpowers can have misunderstandings. And so that's the reason we want to get rid of confrontation. Or else we have to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly we can't have nuclear weapons and confrontations. It risks all life on the planet. And all it takes is a misunderstanding.
But the trust cannot be built overnight. Maybe it would be a good idea, say, to return to the older approach of agreeing to disagree.
Well, that was part of the reduction of tensions during the original Cold War. It was a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you begin to have talks. You agree, we'll disagree. But we're not going to get up and walk out of the room because we disagree. We'll just go from there and find an agreement. So I think that's the way the tensions were gradually reduced during the Cold War. Despite the opposition here of the military security complex. It doesn't favor their profits and their power to reduce tensions, but it does everyone else's. So I think that the tensions are entirely due to the Wolfowitz doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
They're entirely due to the neoconservative insistence that the United States is indispensable, exceptional, and has the right to rule the world. That's what it comes down to. And this is, it has roots in American experience. There's always been people who thought, oh yeah, we're exceptional, democracy, human rights, all of this. And it's always been a trait, but the neoconservatives made it the basis of our foreign policy.
Messianism.
And this then makes it dangerous in a new way. And so I think as long as that doctrine is influential, until that doctrine's repudiated, until the neoconservatives' influence is broken, it'll be difficult for the United States and Russia to have the kind of peaceful relationship that's not threatening in some way to the world. As I say, it just takes one misunderstanding.
On the eve of the meeting, the ray of hope, so to say, appeared when Washington's traditionally tough rhetoric towards Moscow seemed to have somewhat softened. After the meeting, what surprises shall we expect from the administration? Any new sanctions, tougher rhetoric, or maybe something else more creative?
I wouldn't know what to say. I think the sanctions have proved to be not that effective. In fact, they are hurting the United States. For example, the sanctions encouraged Russia to get rid of its US dollar holdings so that the United States dollar is no longer an item in the reserves of the Russian central bank. It's encouraged Russia to try to do dealings with its trade partners in their own currencies and not in dollars. So when you reduce the use of the dollar, you are reducing the value of the dollar. You're reducing the hegemony of the dollar in international payments. And so that tends to weaken the United States. Also, the United States was finding that all of the sanctions it was putting on the Nord 2 pipeline was really costing it a lot of trouble in Germany, because these were really sanctions on Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And there were sanctions on non-Russian firms involved in the pipeline and the various businesses that were forming around this new source of energy in Europe. And so it was hurting the United States. And so I think the Americans are probably a little less arrogant, having learned the lesson that the sanctions can backfire and hurt them. And so that's a good thing if they're a little less arrogant. And so I wouldn't think there'll be a whole lot of more sanctions. And I noticed too that unlike the Russians, when the Chinese get sanctioned, they reply with sanctions.
Yes.
And I think this has shocked the Americans too. You mean somebody is putting sanctions on us? So I think this has shocked them and made them realize that, well, we're not the only one that can do this. And of course, so much of the industry that produces the products that American firms sell to Americans are located in China.
Yes.
So how can you afford to have China as an enemy when the production of the American firms is in China, just offshored to China? The Apple computers, the iPhones, all of this, the Nike shoes,
Yes.
everything. It's made in China, and it's brought back here to sell. So when it comes in the country, it comes in as an import. So it worsens the trade deficit. So it's the American global corporations that have ruined the trade deficit by offshoring their production for U.S. markets. Well, this is starting to dawn. So in other words, we were trying to blame China for the problem, but the real problem is the American firms who took the production away from American cities and states and put it in China. That's the cause of the problem. And so as realization gradually spreads, people begin to think differently about the issues. And so in that sense, there's some hope. But who knows?
Speaking about the both presidents or the presidents of the both countries personally, what, in your opinion, would be the political impact of this meeting, so to say, for them personally, for their political life?
You see, in the United States, we do not have a media. We do not have public discussion. The media speaks with one voice. And so whatever Biden does, they will spin it in a positive way. So it wouldn't matter how Biden behaved at the summit or what happened. Americans will hear it the way the establishment wants them to hear it. And the media will spin it. You know, we've known for years, if you go look at the New York Times, you look at the Washington Post, they say the same thing. If you sit in front of ABC television or CNN television or MSNBC, they say the same thing. If you turn on National Public Radio, it's the same thing. It's almost word for word, the same explanations of every event. And so there's no media. There's a propaganda ministry that puts out the story the establishment wants to be out. And Biden is favored because he's not a threat to the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Trump was not favored because he was a threat to the establishment. So no matter what thing Trump did, no matter how good, it would be portrayed as bad. For Biden, no matter how bad, it'll be portrayed as good. So there's no such thing in the United States as a person having a reputation or standing based on what he actually does. It's based on how the media spin it. Now, for Putin, well, it shows that he is a very broad-minded person. He can go meet politely with people who call him the most awful names. And then present it in a positive way. The meeting was positive. And so for non-Americans, the world that looks at this may say, well, this Putin is a statesman. So it may have helped him in that sense. On the other hand, other people may say, well, gosh, you know, what's wrong with him? Why would he meet with somebody that calls him a killer and a man without a soul? And you just can't know how that plays out. You don't know whether people on average are going to think, well, he's full of self-control. He's got his ego under control. He's doing his best to reduce tensions. Or they're going to say something's wrong. He meets with people and insult him. And I don't know who. I can't predict how that plays out. And I don't think that I can second guess Putin's judgment on whether he should go to the meeting or not. I pointed out concerns I had. I pointed out how it can be misread, but it's up to him to think that out and figure out. And on the whole, Putin makes Western politicians look ineffectual. On the whole, and if it wasn't so much propaganda against him in the United States, I think he would be admired. He'd be looked up to because he's so low-key and so self-possessed. And, I think that's his rare traits.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shame that the leadership potential he has and his willingness to bend over backward to accommodate and reach agreements. It's a shame that can't be better realized because of the American Russophobia, because of Russia's threat. You know, I think I saw a poll the other day that most Americans regard Russia as an enemy. Well, why? Why do they regard Russia as an enemy? It's not done anything to them. I don't understand, except the media. It's the media,
Yes,
constantly the media, and
that's the role of the media.
So the media prevents the leadership capabilities of Putin and Lavrov of working out a sensible relationship between the two main nuclear powers. And I think if it weren't for this insistence on the part of the United States that Russia's the enemy, that Russia could also help mediate the situation between Washington and China. And you know, these are three big countries. They're armed to the teeth. They're not going to be able to bluff one another out or run over one another. They're going to have to work things out. And you don't always have leaders who are capable of that. You know, Putin is, in my opinion. And I think Trump was. And but you don't always have those leaders. And so when you have them, you should be able to use them. But we can't. And that's the tragedy. That's the real tragedy. There's no reason for this Russophobia. You know, just because I gave non-ideological explanations of Putin's behavior, I was called a Russian agent. Stephen Cohen, who's our most distinguished Russian expert, he's now passed away, I think last year. The same thing happened to him. He's been a Russian expert for decades and decades. And he's pointing out we don't need this new Cold War. It's going to be more dangerous than the old one. And so he gets called a Russian agent. And so anyone who wants to sort of ameliorate the situation gets classified as a Russian agent. So I think the one happy thing about the meeting was that Biden was able to go and meet without being called a Russian agent.
That's true. That's true.
So we can, I think, see that as progress.
Yes. So, sir, thank you very much for your insight. And I would like to wish you a good day today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate our conversations and the interviews.
Thank you.